All throughout history, and the beginning of that song has just made it clear that the world and all of creation is groaning for reconciliation. It's groaning to be made new. It's groaning under the weight of sin and guilt and brokenness. And this is personified in Romans 8 in this incredible picture of the pains of childbirth. And there is this new thing that is coming, this new life. But up until that point, there is pain, there is groaning, there is anticipation. And the wild thing is that for those who are lost today, they are still groaning, failing to realize or recognize that the answer has come. And I want this passage to not only highlight the brokenness of sin, but the groaning for an answer. And then I want to show you how Christ is that answer. We have a long text today. We're going to be in 2 Samuel 16 all the way through 19. And I'm not going to read every verse, but I think that this passage paints a picture of God providing a tragic victory in the death of a son for the survival of the rightful king and the rightful kingdom. And that's our main point today. God provides a tragic victory in the death of a son for the survival of the rightful king and rightful kingdom. This tragic victory is a shadow of a greater victory to come. And this greater victory to come is the answer to the groaning of all of creation. And this story plays out with this theme of pairs. We have two opposing counselors. We have two opposing solutions. We have two opposing messages and two opposing responses. And so I encourage you, let's look at the two opposing counselors first. And just to remind you, Absalom has staged a coup, right? He has forced David to flee Jerusalem. He has turned the people's heart away from David. And David has gathered together this ragtag group, mainly consisting of Gentiles who are loyal to him. And David has sent spies and messengers back into the city, into Jerusalem, to combat Absalom and hopefully to overtake him. But David is once again on the run, and his son is a usurper. One of these spies that David sends into Jerusalem is David's friend Hushai, who has been told by David that you will be useful as an advisor to Absalom. Let's look at verses 15 through 19 together. Now Absalom and all the people, the men of Israel, came to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel, man, this is going to be a long sermon, Ahithophel with him. And when Hushai, the Archite, David's friend, came to Absalom, Hushai said to Absalom, "Long live the king! Long live the king!" And Absalom said to Hushai, "Is this your loyalty to your friend? Why did you not go with your friend?" And Hushai said to Absalom, "No, for whom the Lord and this people and all of men of Israel have chosen, his I will be, and with him I will remain. And again, whom should I serve? Should it not be his son? As I have served your father, so I will serve you." As Absalom enters the city with his own advisor, who used to belong to David, they are greeted by Hushai saying, "Long live the king." And it's interesting that Hushai exclaims, "Long live the king," and not "Long live Absalom." And what we see in Hushai's words is he is very careful not to pledge his allegiance, but to say enough that Absalom believes that he is pledging his allegiance. One example is Hushai's response about his loyalty to whom God has chosen. Right? I'm loyal to whom God has chosen. I'm loyal to whom the people have chosen. Well, that fits David, but Absalom's ego hears himself. "Ah, you're talking about me." Hushai's sly words win Absalom over, and he's invited into the group of Absalom's advisors. As a first order of business, Absalom asks Ahithophel what he should do, and Ahithophel tells Absalom to be with David's concubines. And though Ahithophel's counsel is against God's word, we see that in Leviticus 18:8, It is believed and received as if it was God's word. That's how strong his counsel is. That's how strong his advice is that both David and his son received this advisor's word as if it was God's word. So as the first order of business, a tent is set up on the roof of the palace, and what David did in secret with Bathsheba, Absalom, his son, does in public before all of Israel. Relations with a previous king's concubines in that day would have communicated that you are the successor, that you are the new king. Not only that, but this act would have highlighted David's sin, shaming him while elevating Absalom. As Absalom seeks to display himself to be king in the eyes of all Israel by this act, he is unwittingly fulfilling Nathan's prophecy. He is simply a pawn in the hands of God for the discipline and correction of David, the true king. And this is exactly what Nathan the prophet said was going to happen as a consequence of sin and the discipline from God. But Ahithophel is not done giving his advice. He further advises Absalom to allow himself to choose 12,000 men and chase after David. Look at chapter 17, verses 1 through 4 with me. Moreover, Ahithophel said to Absalom, "Let me choose 12,000 men, and I will arise and pursue David tonight. I will come upon him while he is weary and discouraged and throw him into a panic, and all the people who are with him will flee. I will strike down only the king, and I will bring all the people back to you as a bride comes home to her husband. You seek the life of only one man, and all the people will be at peace." And the advice seemed right in the eyes of Absalom and all the elders of Israel. I want you to take note. Take note of the timeline. Ahithophel wants to move on David tonight. Ahithophel also puts himself at the center of the plan while Absalom sits on the sidelines. He wants to lead the 12,000 men. He wants to go after David. This is key for why Ahithophel takes his life later. This plan is swift, it's efficient, and the results in the forced rejoining of the people of God after the death of David. This is a good plan. Both Absalom and the elders of Israel recognize this is a good plan, and it would have worked. But Hushai has gained the ear of Absalom, and so Absalom not only tells Hushai what Ahithophel has said, but he asks him, "What do you think I should do?" Hushai argues that because David has mighty men, that because David himself is a formidable opponent, and because David is an expert at war, that taking a time-consuming and comprehensive approach is the better way. Instead of an elite 12,000, Hushai suggests getting everyone involved, calling all the warriors from around the kingdom. And instead of an advisor leading the charge, Hushai puts Absalom at the head of the charge. Hushai's advice feeds Absalom's ego with him at the center of this plan. And Absalom loves this plan and believes it's better than Ahithophel's plan. Let's look at how he responds and then look at the author's note afterwards. And Absalom and all the men of Israel said, "The counsel of Hushai the Archite is better than the counsel of Ahithophel. For the Lord had ordained to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel, so that the Lord might bring harm upon Absalom." This is one of the key verses in the whole section. Why? Because though man plans, God is the one who actually and providentially causes things to be. Though Ahithophel's words are received like they are the words of God, God defeats Ahithophel's counsel in order that Absalom be destroyed. Despite David's flaws and outright sin, God is advancing David. He is protecting David. God is for David, even when that means the death of his son Absalom. David is the anointed rightful king, and so those who oppose David are opposing God. And though God is mentioned only once in this whole passage, it's mentioned in the way that he is orchestrating and ordaining all things to happen. It's only mentioned once, but in the sense that it is mentioned, it's saying he's ordaining it. After Absalom receives Hushai's advice by the providential hand of God, Hushai runs to report what he has heard and what he has said to Zadok and Abiathar, two of David's spies. Hushai tells of both his counsel and Ahithophel's counsel and urges David to cross the river immediately. He's at the Jordan River. It's possible Hushai doesn't know which plan Absalom will choose, so he tells David both of them and then tells him to flee because Ahithophel's plan was to pursue him immediately. So he says, go now. I don't know if he's going to choose mine. Go now. But even though Hushai doesn't know which plan Absalom will choose, Ahithophel does. Look at how he responds in verse 23. When Ahithophel saw that his counsel was not followed, he saddled his donkey and went off home to his own city. He set his house in order and hanged himself, and he died and was buried in the tomb of his father. Once Ahithophel realized his counsel was not being followed, he takes his life. Why? Well, because if Absalom, who has taken Hushai's advice, is victorious, Hushai becomes the king's main advisor, and Ahithophel shrinks to nothing. And if Absalom takes Hushai's advice and loses, Ahithophel will be killed by David. So he is in a lose-lose situation, and he has no hope, and so he takes his life. And in this moment, Ahithophel's actions foreshadow another traitor to the one true king. Judas betrays Christ and later takes his life. Well, once Absalom decides on his plan and David hears of the two plans, they both begin to move. Absalom's forces cross the Jordan and David's forces arrive at Mahanaim, where they are refreshed. David and his men are given beds and food, including fruit and grains and meats and cheese. And David can confidently say that God provides a table for him in the presence of his enemies. Isn't that cool? Though David is fleeing, God is providing. God is protecting. God is orchestrating. God will not abandon David. So as war is imminent and David is forced to fight, we're given two solutions to this rebellion. David gives a solution with a certain outcome, and Joab gives a solution with a certain outcome. Let's look at David's first in chapter 18, verses 1 through 5. It says this, "And David mustered the men who were with him and set over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. And David sent out the army, 1/3 under the command of Joab, 1/3 under the command of Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and 1/3 under the command of Ittai the Gittite. And the king said to them, I myself will also go out with you. But the men said, you shall not go out, for if we flee, they will not care about us. If half of us die, they will not care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us. Therefore, it is better that you send us help from the city. The king said to them, whatever seems best to you, I will do. So the king stood at the side of the gate while all the army marched out by hundreds and by thousands. And the king ordered Joab and Abishai and Ittai, deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people heard when the king gave orders to all the commanders about Absalom. David gathered his men. He prepares them for battle. He sets 3 leaders over these 3 groupings from his army. And David wants to go out with his men into battle. But all 3 of them convince him to stay back, for Absalom's victory would be in killing David. Their goal would be killing David. So he says, look, we've got a lot of men, but you're worth 10,000 of us, so you stay back. So David agrees to stay back, but gives one instruction. Be gentle with Absalom for my sake. In other words, do not kill him. David's motivation is clear when he says, be gentle for my sake. The consequence of David's sin and the resulting discipline of God has led to Absalom's demise, and David is feeling the weight of the consequences here. He's feeling the weight. He's feeling the responsibility that what I have done has led to this outcome. And it's possible he is hurting as he recognizes that it's his own brokenness and decisions that has led to Absalom's actions. One commentator says another factor may be David's consciousness of the forgiveness he himself received after sinning heinously against God. And possibly he is seeking to pattern his behavior after that of God. Maybe he wants to forgive Absalom because he is feeling the weight of the forgiveness that God has given to him. We don't know. But David's solution to this rebellion is reconciliation with Absalom. Be gentle with him for my sake. He doesn't want his son's death, even though he deserves it. Everyone hears David's command to treat Absalom with gentleness, which is important in a few verses. And so the men set off, and the battle is fought in the forest of Ephraim. And the battle is an overwhelming victory for David's men. And because of the forest, Absalom's forces suffer greatly as the trained men of David use it to their advantage. David had the advantage because he picked the location. He had time because of Absalom's decision to go with Hushai's plan, which was to slow down, call a bunch of men, and then attack. If he would have gone with Ahithophel's plan, he would have struck immediately, and David wouldn't have had the advantage that he had. And all that's really secondary because God has ordained this. But then the men find Absalom. Look at verses 9 through 18 with me. And Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak, and his head caught fast in the oak. And he was suspended between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him went on. And a certain man saw it and told Joab, "Behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak." Joab said to the man who told him, "What, you saw him? Why then did you not strike him to the ground? I would have been glad to give you 10 pieces of silver and a belt." But the man said to Joab, "Even if I felt in my hand the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver, I would not reach out my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king commanded you, and Abishai and Ittai, for my sake, protect the young man Absalom. On the other hand, if I had dealt treacherously against his life, and there's nothing hidden from the king, then you yourself would have stood aloof." And Joab said, "I will not waste time with this with you." And he took 3 javelins in his hand and thrust them into the heart of Absalom while he was still alive in the oak. And 10 young men, Joab's armor bearers, surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. Then Joab blew the trumpet, and the troops came back from pursuing Israel, for Joab restrained them. And they took Absalom and threw him into a great pit in the forest and raised over him a very great heap of stones. And all Israel fled, everyone to his own home. Now Absalom in his lifetime had taken and set up for himself the pillar that is in the king's valley, for he said, "I have no son to keep my name in remembrance." And he called the pillar after his own name, and it is called Absalom's monument to this day. Absalom finds himself stuck in a tree by his head after being pursued by David's men. It's kind of it's funny, right? He's on a mule. He's being chased by David's men. Maybe he's looking back and he doesn't notice that there's a fork in this branch that's coming up, and his head gets stuck and the mule just keeps going. And so he's hanging there and he can't free himself, right? And this is reported to Joab, and Joab is confused why the servant didn't just kill Absalom. It's like the Lord had just given Absalom over to them, right? In fact, he tells the servant, "I would have rewarded you. I would have given you silver. I would have given you this belt." But the servant says, "I don't care if you give me 100 times the silver that you had promised. I heard the king tell us not to harm his son, so I won't do it." Joab grows tired of the conversation, and he stabs 3 javelins through the chest of Absalom. And Joab plays his part in the killing of Absalom, but to save his own skin, he has his armor bearers finish him off. Joab takes charge. He disobeys David and has Absalom killed, for Absalom is the one who has opposed the king, has opposed the kingdom, and has opposed God. And they take Absalom's body and they throw it into a pit and hurl large rocks after him. And the author takes the time to mention Absalom's monument to himself. Why? Absalom meant to make a name for himself. But God's plan is his destruction. And this monument stands tall as Absalom's body sinks to the bottom of a pit. And it's this contrasting picture. This reveals Absalom's heart to make a name for himself rather than God's. Absalom didn't care about David. He didn't care about Israel. He had no reverence for God. His desire was his own glory. He was a rebel. And Joab's solution wins over David's solution. David wanted to save Absalom. And Joab took it into his own hands and said, Absalom will not live. And the rebellion is over. Joab pulls his men back, for it doesn't make sense to continue the slaughter. But here's the problem. Now it's time to notify David. And keeping with the theme, there are two messengers ready to tell David. These messengers will pronounce two different opposing messages. But let's look at the messengers first. Ahimaaz is the first we see in the text, and Ahimaaz, who is seen earlier in the text carrying Hushai's news to David, now asked to be sent to carry the news of the victory. God has delivered his king. But Joab believes, and rightfully so, David may be angry at the news that Absalom has been killed. And so, as to protect Ahimaaz, can we get a harder list of names? Jeez Louise. And so to protect him, Joab sends a Cushite. And this Cushite is somewhat dispensable, or maybe David would spare him since he has little to no status. He's another servant. So either way, he was more worried about Ahimaaz's well-being than this Cushite. But he continues, and after 3 requests, Joab finally sends him, thinking the Cushite will reach David first and soften the blow. But Ahimaaz takes the faster route and outruns the Cushite. Let's look at the message that he gives David in verses 24 to 30. Now David was sitting between the 2 gates, and the watchman went up to the roof of the gate by the wall. And when he lifted up his eyes and looked, he saw a man running alone. And the watchman called out and told the king, and the king said, "If he is alone, there is news in his mouth." And he drew nearer and nearer, and the watchman saw another man running. And the watchman called to the gate and said, "See another man running alone." And the king said, "He also brings news." The watchman said, I think the running of the first is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok." And the king said, "He is a good man and comes with good news." Then Ahimaaz cried out to the king, "All is well." And he bowed before the king with his face to the earth and said, "Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king." And the king said, "It is well with the young man Absalom?" And Ahimaaz answered, "When Joab sent the king's servants, your servant, I saw a great commotion, but I do not know what it was." And the king said, "Turn aside and stand here." So he turned aside and stood still. As David is told that Ahimaaz is on his way, he automatically assumes that because Ahimaaz is a good man, that his news is good. And the second runner is unidentified, but he also assumes that that man brings good news. David is kidding himself, and he thinks that only good news is possible. His mind is obsessed with Absalom's status. David's only concern in this moment is the status of his son. When told that all is well, meaning David's men have been victorious, he bypasses that reality and jumps straight to what he truly cares about, his son. But Ahimaaz lies to him and tells him he doesn't know. And it's unclear whether this is self-preservation or it's people-pleasing, but it doesn't take long for David to learn the truth. Look at verses 31 and 32. And behold, the Cushite came. The Cushite said, "Good news for my lord the king. For the Lord has delivered you this day from the hand of all those who rose up against you." And the king said to the Cushite, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" And the Cushite answered, May the enemies of my Lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like that young man. The Cushite approaches, and once again, good news is proclaimed. And it truly is good news. God has delivered David from the hands of his enemies, and it is indeed God's doing. God has delivered David from this usurper, from this rebel. Though David is under the chastening discipline of God, he is delivered, he is shown grace, and his kingdom is restored. But David once again quickly bypasses this good news and wants to know the status of his son. And though it is a politically correct answer, the Cushite responds in such a way that it is clear Absalom has died. May the enemies of my Lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like that young man. God's deliverance of David is by the death of his son Absalom. And this is not only God's grace to David, it is also discipline for David. And it's judgment on Absalom. God is both disciplining David through Absalom's rebellion and showing grace to David by squashing the rebellion. But David doesn't see the grace. He doesn't see God's hand. He only sees the consequences of his sin in the death of his son. And we've got two opposing responses. First, David is grieved. And then second, there's a rebuke by Joab that brings about this king type response, this kingship type of response. Let's look at the grief first in verses 33. And the king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I have died instead of you? Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." This is another key verse to this section. David, deeply moved by the news of Absalom's death, finally, after years, says, "My son." Before he said, "that young man." He called him other things, and here we see him crying out, "My son." And he says something remarkable. He says, "Would I have died instead of you?" Essentially saying, it should have been me, Lord. I should have been the one dead. David recognizes the consequences of his sin, and the discipline of God has led to the death of a third son. And he's broken. And once again, this is not punishment. It's discipline and it's consequences. It's also God's justice against someone who rebelled and overthrew the anointed king. But David cannot drag himself out of this grieving state. He does not see the victory. He only sees the tragedy. Only the result of his sinful rebellion on his family and on the nation. Look at the effects that it's had on the nation. Verses 1 through 4 of chapter 19. It was told Joab, "Behold, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom." So the victory that day was turned into mourning for all the people. For the people heard that day that the king is grieving for his son. And the people stole into the city that day as people steal in who are ashamed when they flee in battle. And the king covered his face, and the king cried with a loud voice, "Oh, my son Absalom, oh, Absalom, my son, my son." Joab arrives back into the city and is told of the king's unconsolable grief. And David's men slink into the city. They suppress their joy and begin to grieve as if they had done something wrong, as if their victory was actually a loss. And David continues to cry out, "My son, my son." David's grief turns to a national grief. David is king. He has an incredible influence on the mood and the response of the nation. And what the nation saw was David lock himself in a room crying out about the death of the traitor and the usurper. What was the nation supposed to think? What were they supposed to do? And so Joab steps in, as we continue to see, and calls David to respond differently. Look at 5 through 8 of chapter 19. Then Joab came into the house to the king and said, "You have today covered with shame the faces of all of your servants, who have this day saved your life and the lives of your sons and your daughters and the lives of your wives and your concubines, because you love those who hate you and you hate those who love you. For you have made it clear today that commanders and servants are nothing to you. For today I know that if Absalom were alive and all of us were dead today, then you would be pleased. Now therefore arise, go out and speak kindly to your servants. For I swear by the Lord, if you do not go, not a man will stay with you this night. And this will be worse for you than all the evil that has come upon you from your youth until now." Then the king arose, and he took his seat in the gate. And the people were all told, "Behold, the king is sitting in the gate." And all the people came before the king. Joab rebukes David and says, "Your grief is affecting the nation. It's affecting the morale of your army, and they've just saved you and your family. And you're treating them like you hate them, and you're treating the enemy like you love them." And he makes this claim that David would be happier if Absalom was alive and all of his servants were dead. And he says, "Go out there and be king, David. Go out there and make yourself visible so that your whole army doesn't just leave you." Joab wants David to recognize that he's king and that Absalom was a traitor and a usurper, and now he has a kingdom to run. God has delivered you, so get up and lead. And David responds and resumes the business of kingship, which encourages the people, at least at the moment. So let me just summarize all this in three points. First, Absalom rebelled against the king, setting himself up as king. He pushed David out. He sought his life. He sought his position. He sought his power and influence. He shamed him in front of the nation, and he built a monument to himself for his glory. He was a rebel. And God squashed the rebel in order to reinstate the rightful king. God, by his providence, caused Absalom to not take Ahithophel's counsel and instead take Hushai's counsel, and as a result was defeated, he was brutally murdered, and he was shamefully buried. And David longed to trade places and is stricken with grief over the consequences of his sin. David failed to see God's grace and judgment through this and grieved the death of his rebellious, traitorous son. His desire was his own death instead of the death of his son. David grieved not only for his son's death, but also for his role in his son's death. We see David groaning for a different way. We see him crying out for something different. We see David groaning for a different answer, a different death. Is there an answer for this groaning? For this grief, for this guilt? It's like he joins all of creation in groaning for something else. And what I want to do is I want to take these summary points and I want to view them through the lens of the answer. I want to view them through the lens of the gospel. There is an answer for this groaning. We, like Absalom, have rebelled against God and have set ourselves up as king. We so badly want to be David in these stories, right? We want to conquer the giants and we want to rule the kingdom and we want to be the righteous king, but we're more like Absalom. We deserve to be squashed. We deserve the death that Absalom died. We have set ourselves up as rulers on our own, and by our own lives have set up monuments to our own glory. And we've rejected Christ. This is what every person on the face of the earth has done through our sin. And our sinful decisions, we're saying, I'm the ruler of my own life. I know better. I don't trust God. I will be my own king. And we deserve death. We deserve to be treated like a traitor, like a usurper, like a rebel. And our lives are like metaphorical monuments that we set up in the face of God. And we say, my way's better. when really we deserve to be thrown into a pit with rocks heaped on top of us. Is there another way? Instead of us being crushed, God crushed his Son in our place. God, even in our rebellious, disgusting, sinful, and dead state, loved us. And he loved us enough that he wanted to redeem us. He wanted to reconcile us to himself. And so the way he went about doing that was to send a perfect substitute to live the life that we are commanded to live, an obedient life, not the life of a rebel, but the life of a servant. And then that servant took the punishment that we deserve because we couldn't live that perfect life. And Jesus, the true and rightful king, the righteous branch from David's line who knew no sin, became sin for us. And he took the guilt, and he took the payment, and he took the verdict that belonged to us, and he traded places as David cried out to do. But Jesus was able to do it because he was a spotless sacrifice, sufficient payment for the sins of the elect. So what happened to us who are like Absalom? What happens to Jesus? What happens is Jesus takes the death that we deserve to die. And Jesus, unlike David, took our place in order for rebels like us to take his place. Because Jesus took our place, we are united with him in his place. Jesus rose, conquering sin, conquering death, and all those who place their faith in him, in his work, in his salvation, and surrender to his kingship. We are considered sons and daughters of the King and are presently, positionally seated with him in the heavenly places. Here's the wild thing about salvation. It begins with us traitors fighting for the throne. And then God, instead of obliterating us for fighting for the throne, kills his own Son in our place, and then joyfully and graciously offers for us to sit on the throne with Christ, who he's resurrected from the dead. It begins with us trying to take the throne, and it ends with us sitting on the throne. How is that possible? Jesus, that's crazy. That's crazy. Jesus endured the cross for the joy that was set before him and despised the shame. We are that joy. We are the glory of Christ. I can get through this. Give me a second. He endured the humiliation. He endured the shame. He took the guilt for the joy of saving us for the glory of God. David was stricken with guilt over the result of his sin, but Christ was stricken to take away the guilt because of our sin. And now we no longer have to live condemned. We no longer have to live with guilt. Christ took the condemnation. He took the guilt. And yes, our sin is wicked, and yes, we should grieve our sin. But quickly remind yourself of the glory and the beauty of Christ, and your standing in him, your position in him, your inheritance in him. David wasn't good enough to trade places with Absalom. He couldn't pay for Absalom's rebellion. And we, too, are not good enough to erase our sin. We're unable to make that payment. But Jesus can, and Jesus did. And now rebels like you and me can joyfully join God in his kingdom, knowing the enemy has been conquered. Death has been defeated. Sin is no more. Has no more power. And the price has been paid. The Son of David has conquered the Absalom rebellion in us by dying in our place and rising again. And some of us need a Joab-style rebuke. Not to say, get over your guilt and go run your kingdom, but to say, Jesus took your guilt, now go out there and participate in his kingdom. Jesus took the guilt. Jesus took the condemnation. And now we get to participate and kingdom work without any condemnation because he's cast our sin as far as the east is from the west. Instead of us going into the pit, he cast our sin into the pit. Your story doesn't have to end like Absalom's. Jesus was and is a better king than David, and instead of wishing to trade places, he actually did. And for some of you, you're still holding on to guilt and you're paralyzed by it. You can't move past it. Brothers and sisters, let the gospel of Jesus Christ wash over you. Your sin is not bigger than God's grace. It's not. And for some of you, you're grieving what you've lost when you gained Christ. And here's what I mean. God provided David the victory. He granted David grace and mercy, but he was so lost in his grief that he could not do what God had called him to do. God has delivered him, but all he could focus on was the thing that he lost before he was delivered. Jesus is better than the things that he has freed you from. He is better. His grace is better. His mercy is better. And for some of you, you're still holding on to anger and hatred or are unwilling to forgive because someone has wronged you. Friends, if God did not withhold forgiveness from you, neither can you withhold forgiveness from them. He is the only one who has any justification to withhold forgiveness. We are not more holy or more deserving than God. And so the question I ask of you today is, are you letting the gospel shape your life? Are you still holding on to the old way, failing to trust that Jesus is enough? Because that's really what it comes down to. Jesus is sufficient. Jesus is sufficient. Do you trust that? And if you trust that, then guilt needs to be surrendered. Then pride needs to be surrendered. Then condemnation needs to be surrendered. Those are no longer your identity. And so I encourage you guys as we close this sermon to consider how the gospel has reshaped who you are and what you do. Because in Christ, you are a new creation. You are no longer rebel. You are now son. Let's pray.